A brief history. Korean War 1950 to 1953. The Korean War is the war in the Korean Peninsula between North Korea and South Korea in 1950 to 1953, and it was one of several military conflicts that occurred during the Cold War. Korean War was one of the deadliest conflicts of the Cold War era, with approximately 3 million lost of life in the war. Until today, the peninsula is still divided into two countries, and the war never officially ended because there was no peace treaty. Many scholars call this war is the Forgotten War, because the history of this war is often overshadowed by the history of the victory of the Allies in World War II. Therefore, this video is intended to give a brief overview of the history of the Korean War. So, without any further ado, let's get started. The main causes of the Korean War. Historians generally agree on several main causes of the Korean War, including the spread of communism during the Cold War, American containment, and also the Japanese occupation of Korea during World War II. After the surrender of the Japanese Empire in 1945, the Korean Peninsula soon fell under the influence of the Soviet Union and the US. The Soviet Union and the US then divided the peninsula into two occupation zones, the North and the South. The US advised the South as it transitioned to a republic, and the Soviets took the North and installed communist leader Kim Il-sung. The two sovereign states in the peninsula were effectively established in 1948, and the border between the two states is called the 38th parallel. The war can be perceived as a civil conflict that becomes a proxy war between the superpowers competing for the influence of the ideologies of communism and democracy. The beginning of the war. The Korean War began on June 25, 1950, when some 75,000 soldiers from North Korea poured across the 38th parallel. The United Nations was quick to respond and soon encouraged its members to support the South. Many countries sent troops to the peninsula, including the United States, Great Britain, Canada, Australia, India, New Zealand, and even South Africa. The United Nations commander, General MacArthur, in 1950 instructed an amphibious landing at Incheon, a port halfway up the Korean peninsula. His forces were able to drive the North Korea Army, KPA, back into the north and up to the Yalu River, the border between China and North Korea. At this point, China, under the name of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, CPV, entered the war and again pushed United Nations forces back into the south. One of the reasons why China, under the leadership of Zedong, helped out North Korea was because China would like to improve China's prestige in the communist world. The end of the war. The armistice negotiations began during the first half of 1951 fighting and ended in 1953. Over those 2 years, representatives from the United Nations Command, KPA, and CPV met in Kaesong and later, Panmunjom. However, the negotiations achieved little initial success, and the opposing armies continued to face each other in trenches little more than a mile apart for the next 2 years. Finally, on July 27, 1953, an armistice was signed agreeing that North and South Korea remain separate and occupy almost the same territory they had when the war began.